Thank you, thank you. I am so happy that I get a chance to do this conversation because I really loved this book, The 272. Old folks in my community like to say when it's right on time. And this is a book that is right on time for this moment, Rachel. It seems to be, it's a book about the past, but in so many ways it is in direct conversation with the moment that we're living in. If you're reading this book, you're in the back of your mind thinking, okay, there are people that are trying to tell us that slavery actually benefited people. There are people who are trying to erase this history. I loved the research in this. I love the passion in this. I love the contradictions and the complexities. And I love that you've repeatedly mentioned people's names. Because the 272, it's easy to see that as a number, to see when you talk about the enslaved, to think about this cohort of people who were working in bondage. But what you were doing repeatedly by mentioning their names is reminding us that they are human beings. And just at the beginning, I'm just going to read some of these names just because I want to bring them into the room with us because they're names we must know. And in the beginning of the second chapter, you just list a series of names that were along with the hogs and the milk cows, candlesticks and chalices. He handed over 15 black men and women. This is just a small number of those names, but let's just bring a few of those names into the tent with us. Will, Jack, Kit, Peter, Mary, Teresa, Claire, Peggy, Jack, Clem, Tom, James, Betty, Kath, and Susan. And this is also the story of Anne Joyce and the Mahoney family. So let us just keep those names in mind as we talk. Rachel, thanks for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's just wonderful to be here, I gotta say.
And this began with an email.
It began with an email. And, sometimes stories and books kind of, emerge that way, kind of serendipitously. A colleague of mine on the business desk of the New York Times got an email from a Georgetown alum who was a CEO of a tech company in Cambridge. And he wanted to pitch a story to the New York Times, an exclusive he was offering about an 1838 slave sale that benefited Georgetown University. And my colleague was intrigued and uncertain because a slave sale, a 19th century slave sale, was that even a story? And it is my great fortune that she didn't delete the email, that she remembered that there was someone at the Times who might know if this was a story. And so she forwarded it to me. And I took one look and knew immediately. My first book about Michelle Obama's ancestors, enslaved ancestors, allowed me to explore how slavery had shaped American families. And I could see right away that this would be, for me, the next step in the research that I wanted to do, which was to explore how slavery shaped American institutions. And also, I happen to be black and Catholic, and Catholic priests owned people, enslaved people, bought and sold people. I was astounded, and I wanted to know more about the priests, and I wanted to know more about the families.
I happen to be black and Catholic also, which is why this book was such a painful read, because there are a number of phrases that are just contradictions. Jesuit plantation,
Jesuit plantation.
and yet there were many of them, and you focus on a few of them
Right.
in the book.
Yeah, it is a contradiction. And what I often like to do when I'm talking about the book, just to set the stage for, the history and the conversation, is to introduce you to the plantations and to the 272. And to do that, I need to bring you all back for a moment from this place, back to November of 1838, to the docks of Alexandria, Virginia, not far from where the nation's capital is now. And if you had been standing on the wharf there that day, you would have seen them. Scores of people being loaded onto a ship, forcibly loaded. There were elderly people, husbands and wives, children, babies. You would have seen the crush of the crowd, parents clinging to their children, babies wailing. Eyewitnesses described people falling to their knees begging for mercy. And these were enslaved African Americans who had been sold and were about to be shipped down to the deep south, far from the world that they knew and the people that they loved. And they had been enslaved by some of the nation's most prominent Catholic priests who happened to be among the nation's, Maryland's largest slaveholders. And when times got tough, these priests did what a lot of people did, which was to sell off their assets. And in this instance, those assets were, we're talking about human property, human beings, 272 men, women, and children to save their prized mission project, the university, the first Catholic institution of higher learning, Georgetown. And they were successful in this strategy, right? The sale went through, the money came in. Georgetown, as we know, is now one of our elite universities, but it came at a terrible, terrible cost. And these families were torn apart and almost forgotten for nearly a century, more than a century. And this reliance on plantations, on slavery and slave labor and slave sales is just history that most of us are unaware of.
You say most of them were forgotten. The gentleman who had contacted you was troubled because when he saw that number and he asked what happened to them, the answer was that they just all died.
Right.
And that was not satisfying to him.
That was not. And again, there's so much that's kind of random about how articles and books come together. So students at Georgetown had staged a protest because they were concerned that two buildings on the campus carried the names of two of the early presidents who were involved in this sale. And so the administration, which had been considering changing the names, changed the names. And this Georgetown alum in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is watching all this and says, okay, buildings, names changed, etc. But the 272, like, who were these people? And so he reached out to a member of the faculty. Georgetown had established a working group to wrestle with its history, even before the protests, even before my articles. And so this alum, a guy by the name of Richard Cellini, reached out to a member of the faculty who was on the working group and said, okay, 272 people, what happened to them? They're shipped down to Louisiana. What about descendants? And the guy says, they all died. And Richard is like, 300 people, nearly 300 people, and they all died? And the guy said, yeah, they all died. And Richard did not believe that for 1 second. And he's an interesting person. He's a white guy who had never been really active in social justice or racial justice causes or issues, but he loved Georgetown. And he said, I kind of feel like the university owes its existence to these people. How do we not know who they are? How do we not know their names? And so he said, well, I'm going to find out. And so he hired a team of genealogists and started working. And when he reached out to us in January of 2016, his genealogists were digging, trying to, again, to connect the past to the present. And by the time my first story ran in April of 2016, under the headline, 272 slaves were sold to save Georgetown, what do we owe their descendants? His team had identified about a handful of those descendants.
So, how many of you have been to Georgetown in Washington, D.C.? It's a beautiful campus, yes? If you haven't been to Georgetown, you've probably seen them play basketball. You know of Georgetown in some way. But Georgetown was, at this point, a struggling institution. It was having a hard time attracting students. It didn't have the best reputation. And prior to selling the 272, they had already sold some other people who were thought to be older or lazy or.
Right, right. So yeah, so when I got started with this I was writing about that sale that I described to you, that sale in 1838. As I started digging more and doing more research, I realized that, wow, this goes back much further. That it wasn't just this 1838 sale, that there were a number of sales along the way. that it wasn't even just Georgetown, that these Catholic priests who established Georgetown actually built the underpinnings of the Catholic Church in the United States. These folks, the names that Michele read were from the oldest documented record of Jesuit slaveholding, which was in 1717. And these priests who relied on slavery and slave labor to sustain themselves and to expand built the nation's first archdiocese, the nation's first cathedral, the first Catholic institution of higher learning, Georgetown. The priests who operated a plantation and sold people established the first Catholic seminary. So it was foundational to the emergence of the Catholic Church. And many historians, some historians who have written about that sale described it as the first time, that 1838 sale, as the first time that the Jesuits had turned to slave sales for profit. That in the past, what they had done was sell unruly, rebellious people, lazy people, etc. But the records show a very different story. That they sold people for profit all along the way. And I
And
mentioned
punishment sometimes.
and
The
as
story that
punishment,
got to me was you know what I'm talking
I
about.
do. So they are complicated in a number of ways. One of the things is that they believed that, unlike many white people, they believed that black people were not brutes, not animals. They believed that they were human beings who had souls that needed tending, and that they, as priests, had an obligation to tend those souls. But they forced Catholicism on people, required people to attend mass, and this kind of, you know, requirements kind of varied in intensity over time. But what Michele is talking about was that in the 1700s, for instance, when there were folks who flouted, the church's teachings, as punishment, one of the priests sold children of the people who did that. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So there were again those contradictions.
those contradictions. Yeah.
And at the time, if you could say a little bit about the standing of the Catholic Church, because one of the things you learn from this book is oppressed people can
Oppressed
oppress
people.
people.
Yeah.
The Catholic Church was not, as we see it today, it was controversial, it was pilloried, it was, even though they were wealthy landowners,
Yes.
they were not necessarily fully accepted in both political, financial, social realms.
That's absolutely right, and it's many of us. It's this is history that, again, I wasn't familiar with. The Catholic Church is the largest religious denomination in the United States right now, and obviously has enormous influence in a number of spheres. But the Jesuits who established the church in the United States arrived in Maryland in the 1600s, and Maryland was established in part as a refuge for Catholics who were persecuted in England, and they continued to be, as Protestants took over the colony, they continued to be persecuted. There were laws that prohibited them from voting, from participating in public life. They were, as I mentioned, among the largest landholders in Maryland, and the gentry were very wealthy people. But they were very keenly aware of how they were marginalized in society. And at the same time, they did embrace this slaveholding economy and proceeded to marginalize the black people that they held captive.
Could you say a word about what the Catholic leadership back at the Vatican had to say about this? Because there was a
Yeah.
debate about slavery in the Americas, and also a comparison between the black enslaved and American Indians,
That's right.
and they drew a distinction.
And they did. So, one of the things that I think is so important about this history is to know that, you know, sometimes when you talk about slavery and you do research about slavery today, people say, don't take your 21st century ideas and try and put it on the past. It was legal. You can't cast any judgment. But really, the Catholic Church is an example of where folks wrestled with these questions. And all along the way, there were voices of people raising concerns and raising questions. In terms of Rome and the history that Michelle's referring to, as the transatlantic slave trade is underway, and folks are coming to the Americas and enslaving native people, for instance. There are priests who raise concerns about that and say that this is wrong. And Rome actually accepts that and says that we should not be enslaving native people. Of course, it was late, and as if people who know the history of native people in the Caribbean know that many, many people died, right? But they were silent about the trade in Africans and African descended people, silent about that for a long, long time. It wasn't until 1839, after this 272, the slave sale, that Rome issues statements about the trade, the selling of people. And it wasn't until after the Civil War that the church in the United States and in Rome, comes down and says, some critical things about American slavery. So it's quite a conundrum.
Why was the church in full embrace of slavery at that moment? Was it because they were trying to grow, because they were trying to basically do what other people were doing, or was there something else at work because they could no longer bring over indentured Irishmen when they passed laws
That's
trying
right.
to limit the Irish population because of
Right.
a
This
very
kind
strong
of
prejudice and bias against the Irish?
It's, I think, a combination of things. People to justify enslaving people, priests refer to the Bible. And I think it's also important to know that this is not just the Catholic Church, okay? We're talking about, all the religious organizations at the time. Even Quakers actually enslaved people for a time before they decided early that that wasn't the case. But the Jesuits pointed to the Bible itself, St. Paul's discussion about the responsibility of enslaved slaves and masters. There is this transition from an indentured based labor economy to a slave economy. And again, this is happening in Maryland writ large, not just with the Catholic Church. And then there was, how do they sustain themselves? How do they expand? So I think it was a combination of all of those things.
One of the reasons I was so excited to talk to Rachel, for an American journalist, Rachel is the best of us. She is such a precise, and really, she, those of us who practice the craft of journalism have so much respect for your work,
Thank you.
for your courage, for your bravery, for your persistence. There are, what is it, 88 pages of footnotes at the back
A lot
of
of
this book?
footnotes.
So can we talk a little bit about your research on this? Because, and you're also entrepreneurial. Every time that our paths cross, it's a new fellowship. You've found another way, because this is required to do this work, requires a lot of hustle, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So can you just talk a little bit about your approach to research and how you were able to really put some meat on the bone in telling this story?
So I want to give you a sense of the family that I write about, and then I will tell you a little bit about how I was able to kind of mine the archives to try and bring this story to life. So I focus, when you're writing about slavery, I'm keenly aware as a journalist, I think about audience, right? And I know that there are folks, when you're writing about slavery, who immediately say, oh, no, thank you, nothing to do with me, long time ago, not interested. So how do you engage people? And I immediately thought about, okay, 272 people, I'm going to focus on one family. And so I focus on the Mahoney family. And their experience parallels the arc of the emergence of the Catholic Church and its reliance on slavery. And it starts with a woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who's the matriarch of the family, who arrives in Maryland in the 1600s as an indentured servant. And if you know anything about indentured servitude, you know there's a contract, 5 years, 7 years, where you work and then you are free to live your life. But what happened to Anne Joyce was that this contract that she had, she arrives at a time where this transition that I described is happening, where Maryland is transitioning from an indentured labor economy to a slave economy. And her contract is burned and she is forced into slavery. She loses everything. The one thing that she holds on to, though, is her story. And she tells that story to the white people around her, to her children and descendants, and anyone who will listen. And that story is that my liberty was stolen and we should be free people. And her children tell that story, her grandchildren tell that story, her descendants tell that story, and they resist. So she has descendants who kill an overseer and are executed. She has descendants who take the Jesuits to court. They file lawsuits to try and fight for their freedom. Some of them gain their freedom at the end of that process. Most don't. And so they have to find other ways. Harry Mahoney, during the War of 1812, saves the church's wealth and garners a promise from the Jesuits. They want to reward him for his loyalty and his courage, and they promise that neither he nor his family will ever be sold. And that promise is broken in 1838 when his children are sold. So, how do you do that? Okay, how do you kind of bring this story to life? First of all, there's a lot of dead ends and searching that kind of leads nowhere, because the truth is that enslaved people, as I mentioned, largely left out of the origin story of the emergence of the Catholic Church, they're were barred by law and by practice from learning to read or write. So letters, journals, the stuff that historians rely on to illuminate stories are really hard to come by. Newspapers don't, at the time, don't, write about the milestones and accomplishments in enslaved families. I often felt like these were ghosts passing through that, I was trying to bring to life. The things that helped me, and one of the reasons why I chose this family, was, for instance, they filed a lawsuit. Those are records. Those records still exist. Those were incredible records because they had the testimony of Anne Joyce's descendants. They had the testimony of people who knew her, white people and black people who knew her. So I was able to kind of carry that story back to the 1600s and to that time when the lawsuit was filed in the late 1700s. But then you're relying on, black people were property. So you're relying on property records. You're relying on tax records. You're relying on estate records. As Michele mentioned when she did that reading, you're looking at documents that include, tablecloths, china, furniture, pigs, sheep, people. The descendants tell their story too. That story of Anne Joyce continues in that family into the 20th century. And so they held on to a story and kept it, even though in the archives, they appear only fleetingly. And some of the priests also write about these families. So you're kind of trying to, and I should say also, the Jesuits they were good record keepers. And many of these families remained Catholic even after being betrayed by the church. And so the sacramental records are really important too. But it often feels like you're just threading together, you know, weaving together these strands to try and do this. And there are so many absences and so many questions that I can't answer. Right?
But you had such detail. Like we learned that someone had a sweet tooth and that he liked
Yes.
whiskey. And I was wondering, how did you know that?
Well, one of the things is I've always been a journalist who loves records and research, and I kind of love a good mystery. So the hunt for me is like awesome. So, for instance, and also I'm better known as a writer probably at the Times, but records really matter to me. So I want to make it vivid for you. So I wanted to be able to say, well, in the spring, it was around when the peaches,
Yes.
the peach trees or the apple blossoms, the cherry blossoms bloomed, and there are almanacs from the 1830s that describe,
I
the
remember that. You said the peaches were in bloom and the apples were yet to
yes,
come. It's
yes,
beautiful writing and beautiful
yes.
imagery.
So, and I also relied on, contemporaneous voices from the time. Enslaved people wrote narratives after escaping, and so some of those people lived in places where the Mahoney family lived, and so I weaved those stories into.
So, what did Georgetown think about your research? Were you sharing this with them as you were finding things, or did you wait till you could give them a dossier or even the manuscript to give them a chance to respond? Because I imagine, well, you write about this, that it caused a little bit of indigestion
Yes.
at the university.
I mean, it's interesting because, on the one hand, Georgetown really grappled with history. Like I said, they started looking at this before the protests, before I started writing. So they were, they knew that they had to grapple with this history. And it's interesting to know what they have done. And what they did was established preference in admissions for descendants, legacy status for descendants of people enslaved and sold by the Jesuits. They established what they describe as a reconciliation fund. They're raising $400,000 a year that will go to projects benefiting the descendant communities. The Jesuits, too, they've apologized. The Jesuits, too, have partnered with a group of descendants to establish a foundation. They've pledged to raise $100 million to benefit racial reconciliation projects and to benefit descendants. That has been slow going. But they were, struggling with opposition. Alumni raised questions and concerns. I wrote about people who, were close to the board who were saying, well, where does this end? Like, what are we doing here? Descendants.
Wait, they asked, where does this end?
Yeah, like
That's an
we
interesting question.
I think because initially, as I mentioned, there were a handful of descendants that were identified. One of the things I wanted to do early on was we knew that there were more, and so along with that first story, I wrote a short piece asking people, do you recognize these family names? The ship that I mentioned that they sailed on the passenger list is an unusual document. It has first and last names of these
The
enslaved
Catherine
people.
Jackson.
The Catherine Jackson, and that's unusual because enslaved people often appear only by first name. So I asked readers, a link to this manifest. Do you see family names? Are you Catholic from Southern Maryland? Are you Catholic and Black and Catholic in Southern Maryland? Are you Black and Catholic from Maringouin, Louisiana? And so by the time where we are today, from a handful of people, more than 6,000 descendants have learned of their history. So I think when some people said, where does this end? I think that's what people were worried about. Like, where does this end,
We want to remind people that we're going to start taking questions, so you can move to the microphone right here if you have questions. We have seen a number of people make pledges toward equity, toward racial reconciliation, particularly after George Floyd in 2020. And some of those pledges have not been followed up with action, with good intentions, but things the flame kind of peters out a little bit. What's happening with the pledges that have been made by both Georgetown, the Catholic Church, and the Jesuits?
So Georgetown, again, students played a role in this fund that Georgetown established. They thought they were taking too long, and there was a referendum where students said, you know what, we are going to impose a tuition fee, an additional fee on tuition that we will all pay because we want to make sure this money goes to descendants. Georgetown then said, no, 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 we are doing this. It took longer than students and descendants, and probably Georgetown had hoped. So that is just got underway this year. The first wave of projects were approved in the spring. So that is now happening. The Jesuits' fundraising efforts have been slow. Even the descendants who partnered with the Jesuits on this are concerned. One of them wrote a letter to Rome last summer saying there are divisions, there are folks inside the church who are dragging their feet and actively opposing this. So it's really uncertain about, $100 million. The descendants wanted 1 billion. $100 million, though, was marked the largest effort by the Catholic Church to try to address this history, but it has been slow going. One thing I would like to say, because I know that we're going to be taking questions soon, is that one of the things that's important for me when I talk about this book is to know that, when you talk about slavery, it's hard history, right? Difficult history. And it is a story of heartbreak, for sure. But I want you to know that it is also a story of resistance, a story of family, a story of faith. And the truth is that, as I mentioned, many of these families remained in the church after this, after the Civil War. Thousands of people in New Orleans left the church after the Civil War. It was a segregated church, and people said, "Thank you, see you later." And it was interesting to me that some of these families stayed. The Mahoneys, for instance, stayed. And I think not only did they stay, many became lay leaders and some became religious leaders in the church. And they moved and worked to make the church more reflective of and responsive to Black Catholics. And many of those family members, remain Catholic to this day.
John, do you have a question?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much. And just second, my ancestor was an indentured servant, but because of the.
Can you speak right into the mic?
Is this not mic
It doesn't
on?
seem like it's on. Is it?
Is this mic on?
Yeah, just speak right, get
Okay,
real
yes.
close to it.
I should know that. First of all, thank you. And second, my first ancestor here was an indentured servant, Scottish prisoner of war, but because of his skin color, no one could break the contract. If I could ask two questions. One is the Brown University, for example, is named after a slave trader. Do you expect there will be changes like that? And the second is, would you comment on what's going on about the teaching slavery had some benefits in Florida, et cetera, et cetera?
Could you all hear the question? I'm
Okay.
just going to repeat it because it sounds like folks over here had a hard time hearing it. So first, John said that his ancestors first came to America as an indentured servant from Scotland, I believe it was, and that because of the color of his skin, that they couldn't tear up the contract. And he had two questions. One was Brown University in Providence, named after someone who was also a slaveholder, wondering if this movement will expand places like that, and wanted Rachel to talk a little bit about the movement in the curriculum in Florida and elsewhere, to note that slavery had dividends, that people learned trades that they were able to apply elsewhere.
Yes. So, Brown University was one of Ruth Simmons, president there, was one of the first college presidents to try and dig into this history in the early 2000s. And Georgetown in 2016, was the first major university to establish legacy status for descendants. But today there are at least 90 universities that are doing this work. There's actually a consortium, universities studying slavery. It's important. Harvard, for instance, is doing this work. Princeton. And it's really important to know, again, not just Georgetown, not just the Catholic Church, not just universities, and please, not the South, not just the South. Let's not say the North has clean hands, because it does not. We're talking about institutions. Slavery fueled the growth of so many of our contemporary institutions. We're talking about religious organizations. We're talking about banks. We're talking about life insurance companies. And there are many institutions that are grappling with this right now. Not only institutions, municipalities. Evanston, Illinois is looking at reparations. Asheville, North Carolina, the state of California. So we are in an interesting moment where, first of all, when I wrote that first story in 2016, I never imagined that I would see any kind of reparations, like, money in my lifetime. So we're in a moment where there is this effort, there is this experimentation, there is this grappling. But at the same time, there are serious headwinds. History is a battleground right now. And there are efforts to ban books. Not only efforts, there are books being banned. There are folks actively trying to prevent the teaching about race and slavery. My first article ran, before the 1619 Project, before kind of newspapers were and media outlets were doing this kind of wrestling, and actually I should say among institutions wrestling, media also, right? Because newspapers ran ads, helping enslavers recapture people. But I felt in the beginning that it was urgent, and it feels even more urgent to me now as there are these efforts to try to stop this kind of work.
Just a note about the fugitive ads. They're often the places where you learn the most about
Fugitive
the
ads
enslaved.
because they really wanted to hunt you down. So they have physical descriptions of you. They describe some of the Mahonies appear in these ads. Physical descriptions, skin color, scars and moles, what you were wearing, what names you went by. They are
Your
a
talents,
resource.
playing
Yes.
the banjo,
Yes.
good with a saw.
Yes, that's
We have
right.
2 more questions, and so let's see if we can get to both of them.
I'm not as tall as the.
David, can you help her bring that down?
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. I'm not quite as tall. All right. My name is Ruth, and I'm at Johns Hopkins. And first, I wanted to thank you for this book, which I'm going to devour, I'm sure. We have a hard history project as well. You probably know Martha Jones, who is a phenomenal human being. I wanted to ask your evaluative judgment. What do you think of the responses that, let's just stay with universities right now? I mean, when Ruth started the project at Brown, that was pretty remarkable. And we had our experience. We continue to have that story that is dogged Johns Hopkins, and the Henrietta Lacks story, which we could talk about for forever. What do you think of these responses? And if you could not hold back, I'd appreciate it.
Honest reaction to the response of John Hopkins, and then we'll take one more question.
Right. Right. So, as I mentioned, the question is, when I look at kind of what has come up in the years since I first started reporting on this and these efforts that are underway, like I mentioned, I never thought I would see it. So I still remember writing in 2019 a story about the Virginia Theological Seminary, an Episcopal seminary, that said they're establishing a fund to, pay reparations. I forget what it was. It was like 1.7 million. It seemed like, who knew, who could have imagined? And that institution is actually, unlike others saying we're going to give money for projects, that institution said we're looking at slavery and we're looking at the Jim Crow period and we're going to give out checks. And they are. They are giving out checks to families. They say these checks will not ever amount to what was lost, but this kind of reparations is, like we can't give black people checks. We don't believe that. We believe that wages were stolen and we're going to do that. So I think on the one hand, I see these efforts that I never imagined would happen. On the other hand, when you talk to descendants who are looking back at, more than a century of enslavement, how I think we've got a long way to go.
Last question from David.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I wanted to ask you, basically, in doing this work, your process of how you take care of yourself You
That's a very
mentioned,
good question.
putting yourself, holding yourself in this history when the peaches are blooming, the apples are yet to come, and evoking so viscerally this history as you reconstruct it. You are holding yourself in that space for years. How do you, on a daily basis, try to stay grounded through that work? And this is something, Michele, in your own wonderful book, The Grace of Silence, have also gone back and held yourself in these spaces. And I'm curious as to your process through
That's a great
through
question. What do you do for self-care?
It's such a good question. I have been, mining these records for, more than a decade now. And, I'm a journalist, and so I'm a journalist who has done, hard, I've dealt with a lot of tragedy and trauma. I've worked overseas. It's kind of the work that I do. So on the one hand, as a journalist, you hold yourself apart a bit. It's not about me, right? On the other hand, that sale that I started this conversation with, telling you about that sale, there was a priest who opposed it, who warned people, who said he tried to stop it, and when he couldn't, he warned people. He said, run, run, when he knew they were coming. And I have sat with that. The Mahoney family, that Harry Mahoney, who had that promise that was broken, he had 2 daughters, Louisa and Anna. Louisa managed to gather up her mother and run. Anna had young children, and she didn't make it. She was sent off on that ship. The sisters never saw each other again. And I have a 16-year-old son. And he and I asked him, you have a few minutes. Who do you take? Do you go? These are, I just don't even know. Honestly, when I was writing about the sale itself at my kitchen table, and, I'm trying to make it real for people, but I'm making it so real that I am myself, like describing them on the plantation, the Mahoney family. Their brother was sold in June. They know it's coming. They know they're coming. We all know they're coming. And as I'm writing that they're coming, I want to scream across the century and say, run, 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 run.
Thank you so much for that candid conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you to both of you, Michele and Rachel. Thank you so much. And Rachel will be signing her book right now. You can purchase it over there at Bunch of Grapes, and she'll be signing for the next half hour. Thank you so much to both of you. Our next session is starting in 4 minutes concerning the book Chain Gang All-Stars. Thanks.